Hey everybody, in this tutorial today we're going to do a simple exercise on how to create a div and have it center aligned perfectly in both vertically and horizontally. As you're a new web developer starting out, at least as I was a new web developer starting out, one of the first things I needed to learn how to do was how to center align my divs. As we all know, when you create a div or you create an element, the default position in a web browser is to be pinned to the left and pinned to the top of either the parent div that it's within or into the HTML container itself. So in here we're going to create a div. I'm going to do it two ways. The first way is just through pure HTML and some CSS styling. And the second way is we'll actually write a div, create a div, and apply style rules purely through JavaScript. So you can see this done two different ways. And of course, as the style rules that I'm using, there are always a bunch of different ways this could be done, but this is the way that I do it. So to begin with here, I've got a blank HTML document open, and I'm just going to simply start by creating a div, and I'll give it a unique ID of center align, and then I want to create a style rule for that div. So I'm going to add a style tag up here into my header so I can get my style rules in. Oops. Get rid of that. All right. When I create a style sheet, I like to start by telling it to have, so I kind of screwed this up here. Let me get rid of that. To tell it to give all elements, remove any margin and padding. You can just do that by simply using the star selector. It selects all elements on the page. If you have a massive website, using the star selector is not a good idea because it does take a little while to apply those style rules. But for this exercise, I just add a star selector. It basically tells the browser to select all elements, remove all the padding, and remove all the margin. Because actually browsers by default add padding and margin to elements, and I just want to strip that stuff out. So anyway, back to this. I've got my ID of center align, so I want to call that in my style tag. So I'll just simply use the hash and choose center align, and I can apply my style rules. So to begin with here, we want to position this. You could use fixed. You can make it relative to the container that it's in, but we're going to say it's absolute for this. So I'll choose position absolute. And in order to position something in the center vertically and horizontally, we have to let the browser know how big it is, like how tall and how wide it is in order for it to center it. So let's define a width of 600 pixels, and we'll define a height of 400 pixels. And we'll give it a background color of black. Oops, found. Okay. So we've created our div, we've made it a width of 600, a height of 400, we've given it a background color of black. If I open up my browser, you can see I've got my div created here. So here's my div, 600 pixels wide, 400 pixels tall, and like we said, it's positioned to the left by default here at the 0 pixel mark and at the top at the 0 pixel mark. So we want this to be center aligned. So there's just a few things we need to do to make that happen. First of all, we're going to give it a left value of 50%. And a top value of 50%. So let's refresh and see what that does. All right, so it's moved our div from all the way up here to right here. And if you were to count all the pixels from the top mark here to the bottom mark here, you would find that this is exactly the 50% mark, because that's what we defined right here, top 50%. Same if you were to do left to right. This right here is exactly the 50% mark from the width of the browser. But again, we want it to be centered. So the way we need to do that is simply add some negative margin to this. So if we were to go margin left, and if we have a width of 600, we simply just need to add a negative margin of 300 pixels. And same with the height. If the height's 400, we just add a margin top, negative 200 pixels. So now, if I go back to my browser and refresh, I've got my div perfectly center aligned here. And regardless of how big I make my browser, it's going to say perfectly center aligned. Okay, so that's the easy way to do this using HTML and CSS. This obviously does not account for, like, if you're creating a website for a mobile device view, that's a little bit further down the road here. You would want to create different style rules for different viewport sizes. But that's the first way to center align your div on a web page. And I am going to do one more thing here before we go on to part B. I'm going to give it a z-index value. And a z-index value, what a z-index does is it tells the browser the order in which items should appear top to bottom, so like a bird's eye view, top to bottom. So think about a deck of cards. So a deck of cards, if you have 52 cards in a deck, I believe, the very top card is going to have a z-index value of 52. The one right below that is going to have a z-index value of 51. And the bottom one, of course, is going to have a z-index value of 1. So that's how you think of z-index values. So if we had multiple things stacked on top of one another in our browser here, you would want to assign different z-index values so you can see those accordingly. And I'm adding that in because we're going to add another div with pure JavaScript, and we're going to have it sit right on top so we can see that. All right, so I'm going to create a new JavaScript file over here. New file. We'll call this center div.js. And I've got a blank JavaScript file here, center div.js. I want to tell the browser to load it in my web page, so I'm going to give it a script tag, give it a source, and there's my center div.js. Okay, so I've told the browser in the head here to load the center div.js file. And in the center div.js file, the first thing we want to do is write a function that we want to load, we want the function to run as the document loads, as the browser loads. So we'll do a window.onload equals function. We're not going to give it a title, we'll just call it function. And the first thing we want to do is define a variable. So we'll say var center div. What do we call our first one here? We gave it an ID of center align. So we'll just call this one center div top. How about that? Var center div top, and we want to document.create element, and it's a div. So this JavaScript is simply saying we're establishing a variable that has a variable title of center div top, and what that variable is we're creating an element in the document with a that's a div type. Okay, so let's give it let's set an attribute. We'll give it an ID. And we don't actually need to give it an ID for this demo. But when I create elements with this, I like to do this so that I can, if I need to, write style rules within the CSS or elsewhere, I can easily reference an ID. So you can actually, with JavaScript, whatever you title the variable, you can also give it that same ID, which makes it nice and easy to do. So we'll give it an ID of center div top. So the variable we've created, it's an element, it has an ID of center div top. Okay. Now we can start writing our style rules. So we'll write them in much the same manner we did in our CSS. At least the style rules will be the same, but it's just written using JavaScript syntax. So we'll go center div top. Oh, this one didn't set right. Let's do that. Center div top dot style dot position equals, and we used absolute positioning. We'll do the same here. And dot style dot width. We made our width on the HTML CSS version of 600 pixels, so let's make this one 500 pixels. And we'll define our height. Dot style dot height. What did we say it was over here? Our height was 400, so we'll make this one 300. And then we're going to say our div top dot style dot left. Again, we want to say 50% of a left position and a 50% of a top position. And then we want to set our negative margins. So we'll go center div top dot style dot margin left equals, and it's half the value of our width, right? So if we have a width of 500 pixels, we're going to set a negative margin of negative 250 pixels. Div top dot style dot margin top, and it's half the value of the height. So if we have a height of 300, again, it's going to be a negative value of 150. And let's give it a background color that'll differentiate it from the div that's going to sit on top of. So we'll say background color of white. And then we want to give it a z-index value, right? So the z-index value of the other one, we talked about z-index values. We gave it a value of 1. So if we want this one to sit on top of it, it's going to need to be a z-index value of 2 or higher. So we'll say z-index equals 2. And then the last thing we need to do in our JavaScript here is actually append this div to the body of our web page. So we'll go document.body.append child, and it's just the title of the element. So that's our JavaScript. And now, so we've created our JavaScript here. We've created a window.onload function. We've defined all our style rules. In our HTML, if you remember, we added in a script tag. We called this JavaScript file that we created. So now if we go back to our browser and we refresh, you can see we have a new div created here. And it's this centered white div. So this isn't a single div with a thick black border. This is 2 divs sitting on top of each other, right? So you've got your web page here, you've got this black div, and you've got this white div sitting on top because we've defined our z-index values. And if you're wondering why would you want to use JavaScript to essentially write an HTML element and apply style rules, it depends on your use case. I actually use this method all the time. I run a web service called Age Verify. And with Age Verify, the entirety of my scripts that I write are written in JavaScript because I don't have access to people's HTML and CSS files on their website, but they want to load in my, my Age Verify service. I write the entire service in JavaScript, and then as I need to create elements on their page, I just simply do it with JavaScript. So it's an easy way to write elements. All right, so that's it. That's a tutorial, short, simple. If you have any comments or questions, just drop it in the comments below, or you can hit me up on my website, gregrichter.com. Thanks for watching.